Thank you for tuning in to The Political Soup, where you hear editorial about the issues of the day and political philosophy. Your hosts are Nick Alex, our progressive, Dana and Pugh, our conservative, Paul Laws, our classical liberal, and here is our moderator and your host, John Toll.
Hello again, and welcome back to the Political Soup podcast. I'm John Toll, I'm the host of the show, and we have the usual suspects down below. If you got Dana, Nick, and Paul, and you'll find out what they're all about if you don't know already. Tonight's topic is going to be about giving up on the Constitution. Yes, you heard that right. We're talking about dumping the Constitution. That is an article posted in the New York Times in the opinion pages. We'll provide the link down below here shortly. And I'm going to start the show off by handing it straight off to Nick. Yeah, I know, Nick. You think I give it to you? I give it to you all the time. But this is your baby here. This one is totally up your alley. So why don't you tell us your thoughts on why we should give up the Constitution?
You're assuming that I say that, right?
Well, or not. Nope. Or
not. Okay, so I'm gonna realize that after I say what I'm gonna say next, that any chance that I ever wanted to run for political office is now ended. But I am firmly in the camp of blow it up.
Don't be too sure about that. Who knows? You know, that might be the swan song of the next big political person in the world. So who knows?
Yeah, so I guess in the spirit, even though it's a little bit past this now, but in the spirit of Festivus, I think I'm going to do some airing of the grievances. I've created a little list of the items that I find objectionable about our current Constitution. And let's just keep in mind, first of all, I mean it's always been a flawed document. Nobody can look at the Constitution and its history and not say that it's not a flawed document. And you can just point to things like the 3/5 compromise and basically saying that slaves are worth 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, but they have no rights and no voting privileges. So, but when I start to look through the document and the things that really bother me about it, and I'll just give you a quick list, and we can go through some of them in a little bit more point by point. But things like there's way too much power from a legislative perspective in the Senate, especially when we talk about small states. Another issue that I have with the Constitution is lifetime terms for justices and judges, and the Constitution actually makes no provision of how to remove a justice from the Supreme Court if need be.
Wait, hold on. Before you continue, let's start addressing these points before we get to.
You want to go point by point?
I think it's going to be a little easier to go point by point. I suspect your list might be somewhat lengthy.
It is lengthy. I got at least 8.
So let's talk about point number 1, and that. Okay. Go ahead and review that again.
So really it bothers me, and I think it leads to an inefficient legislator that we have a Senate that basically gives the same rights to or the same voting power to small states and large states. So let me just give you a couple numbers. The 10 largest states by population: California, Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Michigan, and North Carolina. Those 10 states actually hold 53.3% of the population in the United States, and those 10 states together have 20 votes in the Senate. The bottom 10 states: Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, Alaska, South Dakota, Delaware, Montana, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine. Those 10 states have 2.8% of the population in the United States, and they have the same number of votes, 20 votes, in the Senate. So what it does is it gives and I know we've talked about this before in terms of the Electoral College, but this is different. This is about legislating. These 10 states have the exact same amount of power in the Senate as the top 10 states, even though you're talking about 25 times the population or 26 times the population in those top 10 states versus those bottom 10. So it's an enormous amount of power to yield to a very small fractional minority of the population in the United States, and I think it leads to a number of inefficiencies in how we legislate.
Okay, and I know that you guys are going to actually maybe agree or disagree on different points here. So I'm not expecting you three to have a very uniform contention strategy with this. So, Dana, I'm curious on your point. What do you think about this particular item?
Well, I have another way of looking at that, which is the top 10 states get 1/5 of the power in the Senate, and the bottom 10 states get 1/5 of the power in the Senate. And the key word there is states, and not the population. The people, by populace, get the House of Representatives. The Senate is, by design, going to be more representative of individual states. And that might not seem to make a lot of sense nowadays because so much power has been taken away from the states, but I think the original design of the Constitution, as we see in the 10th Amendment, is to afford much more power to the states as autonomous bodies. And so I think that's perfectly fair when we have individual states, whether they're Texas and California and Florida, or whether they're South Dakota and Rhode Island, to make their own laws and serve their own people, and as such to have equal representation in at least one body of the government.
Okay, and then like Nick pointed out, this is something we talked about before in regards to the Electoral College, and the same concept is applying here, although to a legislative, much more significant, situation. All right, Paul, what are your thoughts either way on that one?
Wow, Danon, you stole my thunder, man.
Okay. I wasn't sure which way you were going to go on that.
It's okay for you to say just what Danon said, and we can move on. It's cool.
Yeah, there's nothing left to say. I mean, honestly, the Senate's about states' rights, and that's really what it is.
Okay.
Yeah, but functionally, that's not how the legislation works. If we're going to pass some sort of legislation within the United States and have functioning government, you need both bodies to act upon it. And so while we say it's about affording the states representation, the states are nothing more than a conglomeration of their population. So again, I'm not saying that you couldn't have a bicameral legislature and come up with a way to make sure that that not everything is determined by population, but it just seems to me the disparity in the amount of citizens represented by the top 10 and last 10 states, bottom 10 states, and providing that kind of equal power just provides for gridlock. It basically provides us a situation, and ultimately that's why I have a problem with the Constitution as the way it is. Yeah, can we operate as a nation? Sure, we can operate as a nation with the Constitution. Are we going to be effective and efficient? I don't believe so, and that's why when I look at what we have overall. With the current Constitution, the way our government's set up, it is implicit in the way our legislative process is broken. We'll get to some other points, other grievances I have with the way the Constitution's set up right now. But ultimately, it's the way the idea that we can grant so much authority to such a small piece of our populace. It's not something that sits well with me.
But
right,
liberals, modern liberal people on the left, are all about minority rights and such. So apply that to the states. What if the people of Texas and Illinois and California voted to turn Rhode Island into a massive landfill? I mean, it works state by state of keeping the rights of the minority and of giving them a voice.
And I think that there are ways to protect the rights of minority without providing such a huge disparity in voting power. I mean, let's say something. It doesn't have to be a perfect allotment to the House, but maybe larger states have more senators than smaller states. As it is now, even in the House, the smaller states get a disparate amount of representation, because a state like Wyoming, based on the way we are proportioned, shouldn't even have a representative, but they have to round up to at least one. So,
well, and keep in mind also that gridlock's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you really don't want the wheels to turn very quickly. I mean, if the wheels are turning quickly, that's generally not good for the liberty of the populace.
All right. Well, let me ask you this, Nick. One of the examples early on in the article that we started up with this in the New York Times, they talk about why should a lame duck House, 27 members of which were defeated for re-election, have a stranglehold on our economy? Why does a grotesquely malapportioned Senate get to decide the nation's fate? Now, that last sentence is directly in line with what you're saying, but what if we flip-flop some of those things so that the Senate still existed as it is, but maybe, the other way, things had to start in the House instead of the Senate, et cetera? What if we just change that structure?
Well, interesting enough. That's part of what ultimately happened on the fiscal cliff deal, right? Is that technically any revenue type of bill has to start in the House, and that was one of the arguments that Boehner came up with, saying the Senate had to act on the House bill because House had passed the bill, and if they were going to come up with even though the Senate had already passed the bill as well, the Constitution said that revenue had to start in the House, so the Speaker was well within his rights, based on the Constitution, to say, I'm not going to look at the Senate bill. The Senate has to look at the House bill, and the House bill wasn't what was being negotiated. So I just think that the way we complain a lot about a government that is ineffective. We marvel at the fact that the Congress before the last election had a approval rating in under 20%, yet the great majority of representatives were actually reelected. That to me points to a broken method of government. If we're showing ourselves to be unsatisfied with the government that we have, yet we continue to reelect the same people that represent us in the legislature, there's something broken about how we've set it up.
But polls have typically shown, for as long as I can remember, that people in general are dissatisfied with Congress, but are generally satisfied with their own representatives.
Yeah, that's right. But that's the issue we have with the way we've decided that we're going to elect the people that go to the House, right? So we have these districts that are drawn, and they're drawn by the two parties in such a way that it preserves incumbency the best they can. It doesn't necessarily. It looks to concentrate voting patterns. You're seeing these weird shaped congressional districts because they want to make sure that there's enough vote from one party or another that can easily carry an election in that district. So you look at a state like Texas that has, I don't know, it has 30-something odd representatives, and while the state might have voted 55% Republican, 45% Democratic, the way that the boundaries are drawn on those congressional districts, you have high 20s. I don't know the numbers right off the top of my head, but 20-something Republicans and 7 or 8 Democrats in their House delegation. Same thing in Illinois. It's the other way around. They're drawn in such a way that of the 19, we have 13 Democrats and 6 Republicans, even though it's not that way if you look at statewide totals of voting. And so that to me tells me that the way we create representation is broken, and it's meant to be gamed, and we need to pull the game out of it.
I won't disagree with that as far as how the districts are drawn, but I don't think that will necessarily change how people end up voting to reelect their specific representatives, even if they're just dissatisfied with Congress overall.
See, but I think that's where we can have a constitution that, if it's different, that we could actually vote for policy and ideas as opposed to people and charisma. So that if Illinois is proportioned 19 representatives, instead of having district by district voting and each person having a congressional district that gets drawn by the two parties, again, to maximize the number of people regardless of how they're represented the vote, vote for a statewide slate, and if 55% goes Democratic and 45 goes Republican or vice versa, you take the 19 and multiply that percentage, and that's how many representatives you get. And that's a way to apportion it without having these boundary games that we constantly have every 10 years because of the census.
Well, you know, actually Thomas Jefferson, I think it was actually lamented the idea that the boundaries were able to be currently or continually redrawn and the like, and he actually suggested at one point that that the boundaries be stable, and that and I may have this a little off. I'm not sure. This is how I'm remembering it. But the boundaries be stable, and that representation be given to more populous areas. You know, given the population of the boundaries.
Yeah, so if you had 3 times the population in one district versus another district, you have 3 representatives in that district and 1 in the other, is what you're saying.
Right, right. Of course, he wouldn't have changed the Senate part of it, though, because I mean, the Senate part of it is the part that is, you know, kind of meant to bring in the states' rights.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to stop you guys right there. If we're going to make it through your list in a reasonable amount of time, we're going to have to move on. So let's talk about the Supreme Court issue and being able to trying to get them out if there's no way to do so.
Yeah, I mean, lifetime terms for justices. I mean, especially when we're talking about the Supreme Court, there are 9, and we see these confirmation fights, and you know, it's one of the pieces of each election. We talk about, you know, who's going to get to appoint how many Supreme Court justices, and who's going to get to appoint a Chief Justice, and you know, you have people. I mean, gosh, I think I was in high school when Clarence Thomas and Scalia were appointed to the court. I mean, that gives them an extraordinarily long time to have an impact. And think about it. I mean, 9 people basically control an entire branch of government for as long as they could possibly live, depending on how long they live and when they get appointed. If they're appointed young, like most presidents tend to do now, they can have 30, 40, 50 years on the court. That is and we don't. The only other the executive branch is the only one that even comes close to that. They have, you know, 1 person in charge of the executive branch, and we limit that person to 8 years. Actually, technically 10 years. I guess they can, you know, start midterm, but you know, for practical purposes, 8 years. But we don't have an issue with justices being on the court for 40 years. I do.
All right, Paul, let's talk about your thoughts on this one.
You know, I guess I can't really completely disagree with that. To be honest, having them in for a longer period of time, pardon me, having them in for a long period of time like that can cause problems, and you know, I can't completely disagree with that.
Okay, Dana?
Yeah, I'm generally on board as well. I think that if the Supreme Court stuck with what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, it wouldn't be such a problem, but we're seeing more and more activist judges, and I think some on the left are even starting to level that accusation as well. So I would like to see, I think Nick had mentioned that the Constitution doesn't really address how to remove a judge from the bench, but I would like to see a little more focus on that even in the national discourse of less treating like these 9 men in black robes like they're appointed by the gods, and maybe start talking about them in the same kind of language that we'll talk about congressmen and senators and even presidents when people are very quick to call for their impeachments. But I don't see a whole lot of discussion about removing judges from the bench. Certainly one way would be to lessen their terms. So I appreciate what some of the founding fathers were going for as far as not having them, not having to have the judges go for re-election, so to sort of remove them from popular opinion. So I would say, yeah, shorter terms are good, but then to still limit them to 1 term and not to have judges be eligible at all to be reappointed.
Yeah,
actually, the Senate was also supposed to be unelected.
how is that originally going to work?
Yeah, it was supposed to be chosen by the legislatures of the states.
Oh, right. Okay, we've discussed that one too before.
And actually, to be honest, I think that's a little bit better situation than what judges are, because, you know, if they start doing bad things, it's really easy for the state to just say, you know, come on back home, we're done. Or, you know, their term ends. You know, they have a 6-year term.
Yep.
Yeah, I think this one's a pretty open and shut case for you guys. All right, Nick, what's your third point?
So it's funny. I was just kind of trying to write this down. I ultimately, when I reread the text of the Constitution today, as I was preparing for the show, you know, it seemed like the founders got tired. Article 1 has 10 sections to it. It's really half of the original Constitution, right? Half the document. They spend a lot of time talking about what powers are granted to Congress, what they can and can't do, how people get elected, how people get removed, that they can set their own rules, and then you start to go to the other 6 articles. None of them have more than 4 sections. Only 2 of them have 4, and those 2, the 4th section is 1 sentence. And then ultimately, the way you look at it is the first 3 articles are about establishing the rules for each branch of government. Then we have a section on the relationship of the federal government to the states that is very small, and I would think that that vaguety causes some issues. Then you have one on how to amend the Constitution, and one on, you know, the debts of the states. So it ultimately lacks any coherent thought about what the rights of the citizenry are and what the rights are of the states in which are part of the Union. It gets addressed piecemeal through the amendment process. But ultimately, I think to have a strong Constitution, or have a very clear Constitution, we should spend as much time as we do in describing how the legislature is supposed to work, at talking about what our rights are. You know, the rights to, you know, assemble, the rights to due process, the rights to privacy, which, you know, the right to privacy actually exists nowhere in the Constitution. So, you know, it would seem to me, if we were going to have an effective Constitution, you know, we should be pretty clear and upfront in part of the document describing what our fundamental rights are underneath this government.
Okay, and I think the right to privacy idea would be a good show all by itself. We could just talk about the Patriot Act, but we'll save that for another one. I'm going to go back to Dana on this one. What are your thoughts?
I was trying to look up. I remember that really the Bill of Rights in general was a point of contention. Paul probably knows better than I do as far as who had what opinions on it, but I remember that one of the concerns about including a Bill of Rights was that it would appear to be a somewhat definitive list of rights, and to say that, well, if we're saying that the people have a right to free speech and a right to whatever else, I'm trying to think beyond the First Amendment, you know, a right to not incriminate themselves in court, that if they have those rights, that it might say that, well, they don't really have any other rights that aren't listed here. And I know they got around it to some extent by saying, well, this isn't an exhaustive list and so forth, but really the Constitution is made not to grant rights to the people, but to define the limits of the government. And I guess I would hesitate to create a Constitution that tries to delve into a little more of enumerating the rights of the people. I think that's how we get bureaucracies and a government that starts to see itself as handing out rights to the people. That's how we get the hundreds of pages of the European Union Constitution and so forth.
Okay, and you know, one of these episodes, I personally would actually like to talk about the European Union's Constitution, because it's something of a curiosity for me. But anyway, again, Paul, thoughts?
Well, actually, I somewhat agree with Dana on this. You know, the Constitution is definitely there. It's meant to remove rights from the government, and, you know, everything else should be allowed for the people. granted, I think it could be a stronger Constitution. I think that our original Constitution was stronger, and there's my ruining any ideas of running for political office in the future now. But our original Constitution would have been a lot stronger in that regard, because our original Constitution limited the federal government quite a bit more, which of course is why people like Alexander Hamilton didn't much care for it. It was a wonderful thing for anti-federalists, not so wonderful for federalists. But I would hate to list out a bunch of things and say, these are what our rights are, because they're more encompassing than that. To be honest, I think they listed too many. I think that it causes confusion, suggesting that these are our only rights. That's and here again another issue I have with our current Constitution. But I would, I would pretty much agree with Danon, although I think it should be a lot less enumerated.
Okay, so kind of it's starting to sound to me that like you guys each have your own part of the Constitution you'd like to blow up. All right, Nick, let's move on to your next topic.
Okay, so another issue is that the Constitution allows for each chamber of the House, or each chamber of the Congress to set its own rules, to basically govern itself as to how it's going to pass legislation, and that again just leads to a number of inefficiencies, and certainly it also opens our legislative priorities up to gamesmanship. You look at things like the filibuster and how, again, I understand the need to protect the rights of the minority, and I believe that there are certain ways to do it. But now we have a Senate that basically is governed by the ability to get 60 votes on any given topic, and that's because, and certainly that wasn't how it was intended. To get the Senate, or actually you look in the Constitution, you don't see the word filibuster anywhere. That was the Senate coming up with its own rules, and they've changed over time, and now it's gotten to the point where if anything's going to get done in the Senate, you need a supermajority. You need 60 votes in order to move forward. That's not okay. Same thing in the House. Basically, we have rules established now. We talked in our last show about the Hastert rule. So basically, there isn't going to be any legislation that goes to the floor unless the majority of the majority party is going to vote for it. You know what? If legislation is brought forth by the minority party, bring it up for a vote, up or down. Let people vote on it so that there can be debate about it. But as long as we allow for each Congress to set their own rules and how they're going to govern legislation and how they're going to get votes to the floor, it's always going to be about politics and gamesmanship instead of about governing.
Okay, and I can see that. And just to educate those of us, or rather, well, those of us, including me, sometimes, in our audience that don't necessarily know all the terms you're using, could you describe filibuster?
Filibuster is it's a parliamentary procedure within the Senate. It's called invoking cloture. Basically, what has to happen in order for the Senate to vote on any legislation, they actually have to close debate. In order to close debate, or as the Senate calls it, invoking cloture, you need to be able to pass a 60-vote threshold. Which, if you can't, even though you might have 58 votes and have a majority of people in favor of closing off that debate, if there's 40 votes against it, that would prevent cloture from being invoked, and ultimately debate cannot be stopped until that vote is taken. So it gives extraordinary results to the minority. It's changed tremendously since the days of many years ago when when you wanted to filibuster, you actually had to stand up and talk during the whole time debate was open. Now it's just a vote procedure, and if you don't get to 40, then they move on to the next order of business.
Okay. All right. Paul, thoughts on this one?
Well, I'm not sure I really do. I don't necessarily view that as a problem. I guess I don't care either way.
Well, how do you respond to the concept that it basically makes gamesmanship easier?
Well, the fact that they've defined their own rules, that's, it is what it is, and there's going to be some of that anyway, no matter what. I mean, it doesn't matter what you put in for and what you set up, rather. That's going to exist in some form or another. It does kind of stink that the rules have been taken to their inevitable conclusions, but there will be inevitable conclusions with any system you set up.
Okay. Dana, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do, just for my own benefit, and traditionally as I was developing my own political views, is to kind of turn everything around. So when something happens, that I say, oh, well, as a Republican, and I'll look at the Democrats and I'll say, oh, they're playing dirty. And I'll try to turn that around and think, well, if the Democrats were doing what the Republicans were doing, and vice versa, what I see it as dirty or what I see it as necessary. And I have caught that in myself a few times, the filibuster being among them, that say when, back when President Bush was in office and we had both chambers were Republican controlled, then it felt like the Democrats were playing a lot of dirty tricks with filibustering and keeping legislation from going through. Now that the Republicans are in the minority, but at least in one of the houses, say back in 2008 to 2010, when the Republicans were the minority in both houses, it felt a little more necessary to me. So I try to be aware of that when I guess, what could be hypocritical in a sense. But I think then I kind of fall with Paul in the sense that I'm a little more sympathetic on the side that's resisting change, which I know sounds kind of like a typical conservative attitude of being against progress and such. But I'd rather look at that on the positive side of slowing down the government and kind of letting people be people and letting society be society, and not being so anxious to have the government jump in and intrude, for better or for worse. So I am a little bit with Paul in terms of saying that I don't necessarily see the problem with filibuster and different procedures which slow everything down, as much as it might frustrate me when it's the Republicans who are kind of the victims of such things. But yeah, I mean, on the other side, I'm also sympathetic to the winners are the winners and majority rules. So I could see an argument for that well, the Republicans lost some elections, and that's kind of the cost of losing. As for the specific houses getting to make their own rules, yeah, I can see a problem with that. I think that's something that we could probably fix with an amendment, assuming that really is broken and that the Founding Fathers didn't have a specific reason I'm not aware of for kind of letting the houses be in charge of that. But I know the pay raises and such that was something that was addressed with the constitutional amendment, I believe. That when a house, is it both chambers, the House and the Senate, when they pass the pay raise, it doesn't go into effect until the next election.
That's correct.
So I think the rules can generally be addressed by the amendments or by an amendment like that. And I think that's something that the American populace would generally support.
Okay. And Nick, you almost looked like you had a couple of rebuttals in there, but I wasn't sure.
No, I was just nodding. I mean, I think ultimately, to me, the issue isn't necessarily about one party or the other, and one's playing dirty or the other one's playing dirty. To me, it's about how do we effectively govern. That's the thing that I always kind of react to. A lot of my friends on the right, they don't like government. They don't think that government's a solution. They don't think that that government's an effective ways to a end. And I think partially that's because of the way government operates, and our government operates as designed by our Constitution. So when I look at the fact that we have, like I said earlier, a Congress that has historically low, under 20% approval ratings as a legislative body, that is pathetic. And it's because it doesn't operate well, and it's not necessarily the one leader or another. It is designed to be gamed. And when it's designed to be gamed, is somebody buzzing me out?
My dog. Yeah.
when it's designed to be gamed, that to me is something that's fixable, and it's fixable by the way you set up the rules of those bodies and the way you elect people to be a part of those bodies. And the way we change that is changing the Constitution, and that's why I ultimately say, blow it up. It's not, to me, I'm not trying to be un-American or anything like that. I feel very American as I discuss this topic, but it's, to me, it goes to the argument about how do we effectively govern ourselves, and we could do so much better. And the problem is that we're limited by this document that was written a couple hundred years ago. That while all the good that it does, it's not a perfect document, and the people that wrote it weren't perfect people. They're not gods or angels or anything else like that. They have their faults, and they certainly didn't understand what society would be like in the year 2012. And we have more effective ways to do the things that we can today.
All right, or 2013 even.
Or 2013, yeah, that's right. Son of a bitch, right. I'm a week late.
Oh, see. Now, Dana, actually, you made some really good points, and I can appreciate you, kind of giving your views on how to stay away from being hypocritical. You think about something as being unfair, but then you realize, well, if your party was in that same position, okay, maybe it's not so unfair because it seems sometimes necessary. And I think that's an important view to take in some cases. Not to discount anything you said, Nick. I appreciated the way that Dana put that. Now we've got time just enough for one more point. So pick one out of your whatever you got left, Nick. We'll have to talk about the rest during some other shows. So what do you got? One more. I know you got a bunch of good ones, I'm sure.
No, I think at the end of the day, I think and this is kind of a relatively minor point. I have two more points, but the other one, the second one, we could do an entire show on.
Okay, we'll save the second one, then let's go with the one that you can do in a couple minutes.
Yeah, I would just say that the whole idea of Senate needing to advise and consent the president on appointments to the cabinet, I think is stupid. If the president wins an election, he should surround himself with the people he thinks are going to do the job. And secondly, if I want to really point to where advise and consent is wrong, it's on treaties. It doesn't work. Again, you get into this whole idea again. 40 senators can block a treaty from being enacted by the Congress, and certainly. The Constitution says it very clear. Only the Senate can actually enter into a treaty. They are negotiated by the executive branch and then ultimately put in front of the Senate for a vote. And it just doesn't work today. A minority a real minority can stop it from going through. And the amount of work that's done on these treaties gets thrown out the door.
Okay, I'm going to give this one to Dana next. So, Dana, tell me what you think about this particular thing. We'll get to you, Paul, because I see you having some lengthier ideas on this. But go ahead, Dana. I'm sorry.
I don't have too many strong opinions, so I should probably just defer to Paul. My only one thought was, again, I'm not sure I have a strong conclusion, but my thought on Congress advising and consenting with the cabinet is that the cabinets do govern or preside over their individual departments, which are subject to congressional oversight in some sense, I believe, right? Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services and that kind of thing.
Congress has oversight over the entire government, considering they have the power of the purse. I mean, they could always defund something.
Right. Yeah, I'm a little thrown because there are some agencies that fall under the legislative branch and some that fall under the executive branch. And, so it becomes a little gray for me in that area. But I can appreciate that Congress does have a role in helping to pick who watches over those agencies, and that Congress must kind of oversee, or if not oversee, that they at least have to keep an eye on. But again, yeah, I also kind of fall back on presidents win elections, and elections have consequences. And to the extent that the department heads are also advisors to the president should be able to surround himself with the people that he knows and trusts.
Now, what do you think about the treaty aspect of that?
I can appreciate not leaving such large decisions as far as how our country interacts with other countries and such, leaving those all up to a single person. I guess I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. That's not necessarily to say I'm completely indifferent so much as I'm uninformed.
Fair enough. All right, Paul, go to town.
Well, actually, I don't have so much to say about this particular thing. It's actually something that some things that Nick addressed earlier. However, I will say, as far as this goes, treaties should be tough to enter into. They should be extremely hard to enter into. I think that the bar should be set extremely high to enter into a treaty. And as far as the people that the cabinet, that sort of thing, yeah, he should have a lot of leeway. The president, I mean. But as far as the thing that you mentioned before, I think it really goes to a philosophical difference. You mentioned that that the people on the right, kind of had a little bit more of a dislike or a distaste for government. But you went on to explain.
I think they said that they view government as a problem, not a solution.
Well, sure, yeah, and you went on to suggest that good government would be a solution, and I think that kind of points to the philosophical difference here. People, at least on my side, tend to believe that governments tend to atrophy into that there is no good government, that good government is not possible, and we haven't certainly seen it in the history of the world. Well, maybe for a little while in this country, but that's all gone at this point. But I think that just shoots down to the philosophical difference that we're dealing with here. I think that you would suggest that government can be good, and I would suggest that it's just not even possible. It's a systemic issue with government that it just simply has to be bad.
All right, well, I think that kind of sums up our entire show, actually. Not just this episode, but everyone you've ever seen. The idea is basically, if I can sum this up for you guys, is that the Constitution, in Nick's opinion, and if he wants to say he represents the left side, the Constitution should be blown up to make government's wheels a little greasier, smooth things out, make things more efficient, in your words, Nick.
Efficient.
And
And effective.
Better, efficient, effective, turn government into a positive force for good, for example. And where I think that Paul and Danon agree and tend to generally represent the right in saying that the Constitution is there to prevent the wheels from getting too greasy, that it is supposed to be a slow-moving machine so that there is minimal intervention between government and the people. And the arguments to that, of course, are going to be, well, if that's the case, then why are all these games happening all the time? And that's something that Nick is arguing against. You don't want the games, but
That's not to say that I wouldn't also vote with Nick to eliminate the government. I would just vote for a smaller one.
Right. Yeah, earlier in the show I said too is that you guys I think each have a section of the Constitution that you would change if it were up to you, but overall the concept is that Nick would change a lot, Paul and Dana would change very little because they like or dislike which way the Constitution is pushing or
I'd change a lot.
Okay.
I really would.
Well, I know you would, but
I'd
you
make
would make
really
it
small.
You'd make it small, but you'd also make it so that government was even less effective in Nick's eyes.
Absolutely.
So that's what I think that the point of the whole show is. But we're going to end it there, guys. And good show. We covered a lot. And Nick, we'll talk some more about what we can use those other points for, because I think one or two of them are probably worth a show apiece.
Yes, that's right.
Thanks again, guys. Appreciate it, especially Nick for putting all that together. Dana, Nick, and Paul, have a good evening. And to our audience, thank you again for joining us. Good night.
Thanks.